The old gardener's wrist turns over the flame, and the eggshells inside that pot begin their slow surrender to the boil. 10 minutes on a stovetop, that's all it takes. And what most people rinse down the drain becomes a liquid that brings a dying plant back to its feet. By the time you finish this case, you'll know exactly how to make it. And more importantly, you'll know why the common advice about eggshells has been failing you for years. Watch his hands for a second. He crushes those shells first, grinding them down until they're almost a powder. And he does it with a patience that looks almost like ritual. But this is not ritual. This is mechanics. The moment those fragments hit the boiling water, something happens that the textbooks rarely mention. And it has nothing to do with the old wives' tale. You've heard about tossing crushed shells into the soil and walking away. Here is the part that should make you pause. If you bury those shells whole, or even coarsely broken, they will sit in your garden bed for months like tiny white stones, doing almost nothing for your plants. That's the trap. That's the failure case most gardeners never see coming. The old gardener from Texas discovered the difference by accident through decades of stubborn trial and error, and his greenhouse has never looked the same since. What he found was that the shell's true power only unlocks when heat forces it open. Boiling does in 10 minutes what the soil would take half a year to accomplish, and the resulting liquid carries the calcium straight to the roots where it matters. That's the first loop. The second loop is darker, and it's about what happens when you do this wrong. Ignore the temperature, skip the straining, or use shells that still carry the raw white clinging to the inside, and you'll create a sour, stinking brew that attracts pests and turns your careful treatment into a disaster. The old gardener learned that lesson the hard way, and he'll tell you about it with a crooked smile if you ask him directly. His name is Seu James, and he doesn't use the word sustainable or organic or any of the labels the stores love. Seu James doesn't need slogans. He just watches his plants explode, and the process starts in a boiling pot, not a soil bed. That's the kind of intel this channel digs up, one scrap at a time. Subscribe to stay on the investigation. Then tell me in the comments, when you tried eggshells before, were you boiling them or burying them? He just watches his tomatoes double in size while his neighbor's plants stay stubbornly small, and he keeps the secret in a mason jar on the kitchen counter. You know that moment when you pour a sack of store-bought compost and catch that fake chemical scent, and a voice in your head whispers that you're doing it wrong? That's the moment Seu James stopped trusting the bags entirely. If you've ever watched a tomato seedling curl up and die after you spent good money on fertilizer, you know the feeling that the garden just hates you personally. The leaves yellow, the stem goes soft, and no amount of expensive feed seems to bring it back. You've probably even tried the eggshell trick yourself, crushing a few shells and sprinkling them around the base like some kind of offering. Crunch goes the shell under your trowel, and you feel satisfied for about a week. Then nothing changes. The plant stays pale, the soil stays the same, and those white fragments sit there like evidence of a failed experiment. That's the official story, the one the gardening blogs keep repeating. Crush your eggshells, add them to the soil, and your plants will thank you. It sounds plausible. Eggshells are mostly calcium carbonate, and plants need calcium to build strong cell walls. The logic is clean and tidy, and it's exactly where the whole theory starts to crumble into dust. The truth is that calcium carbonate in its raw shell form is locked away in a crystalline structure that roots simply cannot access. Think of it like a vault with a combination lock. The calcium is inside, richly present, but the plant has no key to open the vault. Soil microbes can slowly work on the shell over time, but that process takes months. And in the meantime, your plant is starving. That's the first crack in the official story, and it widens the moment you really look at the evidence. Walk through any garden where someone followed the crush and scatter advice, and you'll find the same scene. White fragments sitting on top of the soil, looking exactly the same as the day they were tossed there, while the plant beside them continues to fade. The shell is not broken down. The calcium is not released. And yet the myth persists because nobody ever checks whether the method actually works. The deeper problem is particle size. A coarse shell fragment has a tiny surface area relative to its volume, which means the microbes that could break it down barely get a foothold. It's like giving a termite a single bite of a log and expecting it to eat the whole thing. The same principle applies to everything in the soil. Surface area matters, and fine particles react much faster than coarse ones. You've just seen the mechanic of the failure: shell sitting intact, calcium locked behind a crystalline wall, plant starving while the myth lives on. If you want to keep dismantling gardening advice that doesn't survive contact with real soil, subscribe and walk this evidence trail with us. Write unaltered in the comments if you have ever found crushed eggshells lying unchanged in your own pots. Just a dead promise on top of the dirt. Seu James figured this out without ever reading a chemistry paper. He was simply the kind of man who noticed when his hen's eggs got boiled for breakfast. And he saw that the shells after boiling seemed different somehow. Softer, easier to crush into powder. And one morning, out of pure curiosity, he poured the leftover water from the boiled eggs onto his wilting tomato plant. Within days, the leaves began to darken. The stem stiffened under his fingertip. The plant that had been leaning toward the ground started reaching for the sky again. He did it again the following week with the same result. And then he started experimenting with the details, the boiling time, the crushing method, the straining, until he had a process that worked every single time. Here is the hidden truth that the big fertilizer companies would rather you never learn. The boiling water does two essential jobs at once. First, it softens the crystal structure of the calcium carbonate, making it vulnerable to breakdown. Second, it leaches the soluble calcium straight into the water, creating a liquid that the roots can absorb immediately, no microbes required. That's the mechanism. That's why the old gardener's method works when the standard advice fails. The 10-minute boil is not a myth or a metaphor. It's a precise physical threshold, and going past it or cutting it short changes the result entirely. Boil too long, and the water becomes overly concentrated. Boil too short, and the shells haven't given up their calcium yet. And then there is the sediment, the gritty powder that settles at the bottom of the jar. That's gold as well, but only if you handle it right. Seu James strains his liquid through a fine mesh, catching every last particle. Because if you pour that grit directly onto the leaves, you can clog their pores and create the ideal surface for mold to take hold. Hold the strainer up to the light and watch the pale, cloudy water run through. That liquid is the whole case in a glass. You can see the faint, milky tint, and you can smell the earthy mineral note that rises off it. Nothing like the sour rot of a failed batch. This is what revives a plant, and it costs you nothing but the shells you are about to throw away. You've been paying for bottles of calcium supplement for your plants when the raw material was sitting in your kitchen bin the whole time. Turn over that bottle on the shelf and look at the price tag. Then look at the eggshells in your compost bucket and do the math for yourself. It's the kind of difference that makes you feel like you've been part of the joke for years. Now comes the part where you stop being the spectator. Tomorrow morning, before the sun climbs too high, save the shells from your breakfast eggs, rinse them clean, because egg white left on the surface will turn your brew rancid. Then crush them, not into coarse chunks, but into a fine grit, the consistency of coarse sand. Feel the fragments crack under your palm and listen to that dry, sharp crunch. That's the sound of surface area multiplying. Drop that grit into a pot of water, 1 liter for the shells from about 6 eggs, and bring it to a rolling boil. The moment the water starts churning, set a timer for 10 minutes and don't walk away. Watch the water take on that faint haze and notice how the shell fragments start to settle differently, softer, almost chalky. That's the visual proof that the calcium is leaving the shells and entering the water. After the 10 minutes, kill the heat and let the pot cool completely. Don't rush this. Hot liquid can shock the roots of a stressed plant, and you've already seen how easily things go wrong. Strain the liquid through a fine cloth or a sieve, catch every last bit of shell grit, and pour the cooled liquid around the base of your most pitiful plant. Use it sparingly, maybe half a cup for a small pot, and water as you normally would. That brew you just made is a case file you can reproduce, and the results are waiting for you to collect them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of forensic evidence. We're already dusting off another kitchen scrap in the lab. Leave a comment with the name of the plant you're going to treat first, and in a week, come back and tell me what shade of green you're seeing. What you're waiting to see is the response, and it won't be instant, but it will be real. Within a few days, the leaves should gain a deeper, richer green. The stems should feel firmer when you press them gently. If the plant had been drooping, it should begin to lift its head again, slowly, like someone waking from a long sleep. That's the evidence mounting in real time, right in your own terracotta pot. Now watch this part carefully, because this is where most gardeners wreck the whole experiment. If you skip the boiling and use raw shells, you'll be waiting months for any result, if you get any at all. If you use unwashed shells, the leftover egg white will make the liquid smell like sulfur and rot, attracting fruit flies to your kitchen and mold to your soil. And if you forget to strain it, you'll be spraying gritty water all over your plant's leaves, clogging the pores that let it breathe. One mistake in this chain, and you're right back where you started, staring at a pale plant and a jar of wasted effort. That's the failure case, and it's not a scare tactic. It's the difference between a method that works and a myth that doesn't. Seu James learned all of this by ruining a few batches himself, and he'll be the first to tell you that he has the compost bin of failures to prove it. Try this version for yourself, and I warn you, you'll start looking at your breakfast eggs differently. You'll catch yourself counting shells, hearing the 10-minute timer in your head, planning which plant gets the first dose of liquid gold. The old gardener's method is not magic. It's patience and heat and particle size, and now it's sitting in your kitchen waiting to be unlocked. Picture your drooping rose bush 3 days after you pour that cooled liquid at its roots, standing taller under the humid morning sun. The leaves a shade of green you haven't seen in months. That's the image worth carrying into the kitchen with you tomorrow. You're the kind of person who can save a plant with trash, not the one still buying bottles of promises. And just when you think you've cracked this case, remember that the eggshell is only one scrap in the pile. There's a coffee ground code waiting to be broken, and it works differently from anything you've seen today. That file opens another morning. For now, keep the shells, watch the boil, and follow the evidence where it leads.